"I only married you for an heir," Duke Adrian Ravenshade said quietly on their wedding night. The words fell into the silence of the royal chamber like cold steel. Eleanor stood frozen beside the grand canopy bed, her delicate hands tightening around the folds of her white satin gown. The candles flickered softly against the gold walls of the chamber, casting warm light across the room, but nothing about the moment felt warm. Adrian did not even look at her when he spoke. He stood near the fireplace with one hand behind his back, his broad shoulders rigid beneath his dark ceremonial coat. "This marriage was arranged for the future of Ravenshade," he continued calmly. "I hope you understand your duty." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. She had imagined this night differently, not childish fantasies of perfect romance. She had known the Duke was distant. Everyone in the kingdom knew, but she had still hoped there would be kindness, some trace of tenderness, some sign that he saw her as more than a political arrangement. She lowered her eyes before he could see the pain inside them. "I understand, Your Grace," she whispered. Adrian finally turned toward her. His handsome face remained unreadable. His sharp grey eyes studied her only briefly before he walked past her toward the door. "Good," he said quietly. "Then this marriage will not be difficult." The door closed behind him. Eleanor remained standing in the center of the chamber long after the sound of his footsteps disappeared. The silence became unbearable. She slowly sat on the edge of the bed, her veil falling softly around her shoulders. And only then did the tears finally begin to fall. She covered her mouth to stop herself from sobbing aloud. No one in Ravenshade Palace must hear the new Duchess crying on her wedding night. The next morning, the palace servants bowed respectfully when Eleanor entered the dining hall. But the warmth she had once imagined as Duchess of Ravenshade did not exist. The palace was magnificent. Golden chandeliers hung from ceilings painted with angels and kings. Silk curtains framed towering windows overlooking snow-covered gardens. But beneath its beauty, the palace felt cold. Adrian sat at the far end of the long dining table, reviewing documents while servants poured tea beside him. He barely glanced up when Eleanor entered. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said softly. That was all." The servants exchanged careful glances before quickly lowering their eyes. Eleanor sat quietly while breakfast was served. The silence between husband and wife stretched painfully across the table. Finally, she gathered enough courage to speak. "The gardens are beautiful this morning." Adrian continued reading. "They were designed by my grandfather." Again silence. Eleanor lowered her eyes. She suddenly understood what her life here would become. Meals without conversation, rooms without affection, days without warmth. That evening she attended her first royal banquet beside the Duke. The ballroom glittered with gold and crystal. Music floated through the air while nobles danced elegantly beneath the chandeliers. But Eleanor quickly realized something painful. Adrian never once looked at her. He spoke politely to foreign ambassadors. He danced with elderly duchesses out of courtesy. He discussed military matters with noblemen. Yet his own wife stood beside him like part of the decoration. "You are very quiet tonight, Your Grace," Lady Beatrice whispered beside her. Beatrice was one of the older noblewomen of the court. Her eyes softened slightly as she studied Eleanor. "I am only tired," Eleanor replied gently. Beatrice glanced toward Adrian's before lowering her voice. "The Duke has always been difficult." Eleanor forced a small smile. "He carries many responsibilities." Beatrice watched her carefully. "And now so do you, child." Later that night, Eleanor stood alone on the palace balcony while snow fell softly across the kingdom below. She could hear laughter inside the ballroom. She could hear Adrian's voice somewhere behind the grand doors, but he never came looking for her. Weeks passed, then months. The palace servants grew to adore Eleanor. She treated everyone with quiet kindness. She remembered names. She listened when servants spoke. She thanked maids personally instead of ignoring them like most nobles. But Adrian remained distant. Some nights he never entered her chamber at all. Other nights he arrived long after midnight, emotionally detached even in intimacy. He was never cruel in the obvious ways. He never shouted, he never struck her, but his coldness wounded far deeper. Eleanor slowly began to understand something terrifying. She was lonely even while married. One winter morning, Eleanor sat quietly in the palace library, reading beside the window, when Adrian entered unexpectedly. He stopped briefly upon seeing her there. "You spend much time alone," he observed. Eleanor closed her book gently. "The library is peaceful." Adrian studied her for a moment before walking toward the fireplace. "You should attend more social gatherings." "I attend every gathering you request." "Not as duty," he said calmly. "As Duchess." Eleanor looked at him carefully. "Would it matter to you if I enjoyed them?" For the first time, Adrian seemed slightly caught off guard, but the moment vanished quickly. "Your happiness is your own concern." The words hurt more than Eleanor expected. She looked away toward the snow outside before speaking softly. "Of course." Adrian watched her silently. Something unreadable flickered briefly in his expression before he turned and left again. That night Eleanor cried quietly after the candles had been extinguished. Not because she hated him, that would have been easier. She cried because despite everything, she still loved him. Spring arrived slowly across Ravenshade Palace. The snow melted, flowers returned to the gardens, but nothing changed inside the marriage. Until one morning, Eleanor stood suddenly from the breakfast table, pressing a trembling hand against her lips. Adrian looked up immediately. "What is it?" She shook her head softly. "Nothing. Before she could finish speaking, dizziness overtook her. Adrian caught her before she collapsed completely. The palace physician arrived within minutes. Eleanor sat nervously while the elderly doctor examined her carefully. Finally, the physician smiled. "Congratulations, Your Grace." Eleanor blinked in confusion. "Congratulations?" The old man bowed slightly. "The Duchess is with child." Silence filled the chamber. Adrian stood completely still. Eleanor looked toward her husband, her heart suddenly racing. But she could not read his expression. His face remained calm, almost too calm. "You are certain?" Adrian asked. "Without question, Your Grace." The physician smiled warmly. "The air of Ravenshade grows strong already." For the first time since their wedding night, something shifted inside the room. The servants suddenly moved differently. News spread rapidly through the palace. The Duchess carried the future Duke of Ravenshade, and overnight, Eleanor's position changed. Servants bowed deeper. Nobles treated her with greater respect. The Queen herself sent gifts to the palace. But Adrian became stranger than ever. He visited Eleanor more often. He asked whether she had eaten. He instructed servants to keep her warm. He assigned additional guards outside her chambers. Yet emotionally, he still remained distant. It was as though the pregnancy mattered deeply to him, while Eleanor herself remained secondary. One evening, Eleanor sat beside the fireplace, sewing tiny golden fabric for the baby, when Adrian entered quietly. His eyes lowered toward the small clothing in her lap. "You made that yourself?" he asked. She nodded softly. "My mother taught me before she died." Adrian stood silently for a moment. The physician says your health is improving. Yes. He hesitated slightly before speaking again. The kingdom is pleased. Eleanor looked down at the tiny fabric between her fingers. I see. Adrian frowned faintly. You sound unhappy. A small bitter smile touched her lips before she could stop it. Should I be happy that I have finally fulfilled my purpose? The words hung heavily between them. Adrian's expression hardened slightly. That is not what I meant. Isn't it? Eleanor finally looked at him. You told me yourself on our wedding night why you married me. Adrian said nothing. Eleanor lowered her eyes again. Forgive me. I'm tired. For the first time. Adrian looked uncertain. He stood there silently before finally leaving the chamber without another word. Months passed. Eleanor's pregnancy progressed beautifully, but something inside her slowly changed. She stopped waiting for Adrian to love her, stopped hoping he would suddenly become warm, stopped searching his face for affection. And strangely, that quiet acceptance transformed her. She became calmer, stronger, more graceful. She no longer looked wounded whenever Adrian ignored her. She no longer watched the door, hoping he would come. The palace began noticing the difference. She walked through court with quiet confidence now. She smiled more genuinely. She spent afternoons teaching orphan girls within the kingdom. She rebuilt neglected palace hospitals. She became beloved among the people. And Adrian noticed. He noticed every change. He noticed how servants smiled more brightly around her. He noticed how noblemen respected her intelligence during council gatherings. He noticed how the palace itself seemed warmer whenever she entered a room, and for the first time, something unfamiliar began growing inside him. One evening during a royal banquet, a young foreign prince approached Eleanor with admiration. The stories of your kindness do not exaggerate, Duchess. Eleanor smiled politely. You flatter me, Your Highness. The prince laughed softly. Not at all. Ravenshade is fortunate to have you. Across the ballroom, Adrian watched the interaction silently. His jaw tightened slightly. Later that night, he entered Eleanor's chamber unexpectedly. She looked up from her chair beside the window. Your Grace? Adrian remained standing near the door. You seemed comfortable with Prince Edwin tonight. Eleanor blinked softly. He was only being polite. Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly. He was admiring you. Silence. Eleanor studied him carefully. Does that trouble you? Adrian did not answer immediately. Finally, he spoke quietly. You are my wife. Something about the words made Eleanor's chest ache. She stood slowly. Your wife, she repeated softly. Yes. Adrian stepped closer. Eleanor. But she shook her head gently. Please do not say things you do not truly mean. For the first time since their marriage, Adrian seemed unable to respond. Eleanor looked away before he could see the sadness returning to her eyes. I'm tired tonight. Adrian remained there for several long seconds before quietly leaving again. But this time, he looked troubled. Adrian began noticing Eleanor everywhere, not because she demanded attention, but because she no longer sought it. She moved through Ravenshade Palace with quiet grace now, and somehow that unsettled him more than tears ever had. There were mornings when he entered the dining hall, expecting the familiar silence between them, only to find Eleanor calmly discussing charitable reforms with elderly ministers. There were evenings when nobles gathered around her during royal banquets, listening attentively while she spoke with intelligence and warmth. And there were moments, small moments, that disturbed him most of all, like when she laughed softly at something one of the palace maids said. The sound caught him unexpectedly from across the corridor. It was gentle, warm, real. He realized with strange discomfort that he had rarely heard her laugh since their marriage. One rainy afternoon, Adrian returned early from military council meetings and walked through the western gardens toward the palace. The servants immediately bowed as he approached, but he slowed upon hearing Eleanor's voice nearby. She sat beneath the marble pavilion surrounded by several orphan children from the capital. The children listened eagerly while Eleanor read from an old storybook. Her swollen belly rested beneath layers of soft blue silk, and despite the rain beyond the pavilion, she looked peaceful. One little girl suddenly tugged Eleanor's sleeve. "Your Grace," she asked shyly, "will the baby become king one day?" The other children turned excitedly toward Eleanor. She smiled softly. "Perhaps." "Then he will be lucky," the little girl declared seriously, "because you are kind." Something tightened unexpectedly inside Adrian's chest. Eleanor looked down briefly as though the words affected her more deeply than expected. Then she smiled again and gently brushed the girl's hair back. "Kindness matters more than crowns," she whispered. Adrian stood silently beyond the pavilion for several long seconds before finally walking away unnoticed. But the image remained in his mind all evening. That night during dinner, Adrian watched Eleanor more carefully than usual. She spoke softly with the servants. She thanked the cooks. She moved with quiet elegance beneath the candlelight. And suddenly Adrian realized something deeply unsettling. The palace loved her. Everyone loved her. Except, perhaps, the one person whose love she had wanted most. "The physician says you should avoid stress," Adrian said suddenly. Eleanor looked up, slightly surprised by the unexpected concern. "I feel well. You have been spending too much time outside. The fresh air helps." Adrian nodded once before silence returned again, but this time the silence felt different. He found himself watching her. When she lowered her eyes, he noticed how exhausted she looked after long days. He noticed how carefully she hid discomfort whenever the child caused her pain. And for the first time since their wedding, guilt began quietly growing inside him. Days later, the royal court hosted a grand spring celebration. Nobles from across neighboring kingdoms filled Ravenshade Palace with music and laughter. Eleanor stood beside Adrian beneath the glittering chandeliers, while nobles approached to congratulate them on the coming heir. "The Duchess grows more radiant every day," one elderly countess said warmly. Adrian glanced briefly toward Eleanor. She smiled politely. "You are too kind." The countess lowered her voice conspiratorially. "The Duke is fortunate. Beautiful wives are common in royal courts. Gentle ones are rare." Eleanor's smile faded slightly before she looked away. Adrian noticed. He noticed every small change in her expression now. Later that evening, Prince Edwin approached Eleanor once again. "Your Grace," he said warmly, "I hope Ravenshade treats you kindly." Before Eleanor could answer, Adrian spoke calmly from beside her. "My wife lacks for nothing in Ravenshade." Prince Edwin smiled faintly. "Material comfort is not always the same as happiness, Your Grace." Silence. Adrian's expression darkened slightly. Eleanor immediately stepped forward before tension could rise. Prince Edwin was simply offering kindness. "Of course," Adrian replied coolly. The prince bowed politely before walking away, but Adrian remained strangely irritated for the rest of the evening. When the banquet finally ended, Eleanor quietly removed her jewelry before the mirror inside her chamber. Adrian stood near the fireplace, watching her reflection in silence. "You seemed comfortable with Edwin again tonight," he said finally. Eleanor carefully placed her earrings upon the table. He is easy to speak with. Too easy. She paused slightly before meeting his gaze through the mirror. Are you jealous? The question caught him completely off guard. Adrian frowned faintly. No. Eleanor gave a soft, almost sad smile. Then there is no problem. She stood slowly, one hand resting gently against her stomach as she moved toward the bed. But Adrian spoke again before she could sit. Do you dislike being my wife? The room fell silent. Eleanor turned slowly toward him. Her eyes softened with something painful. I wanted very badly to love being your wife. Those words struck harder than Adrian expected. Eleanor lowered her eyes. But eventually, people grow tired of begging silently for affection that does not exist. Adrian stared at her speechlessly. She climbed carefully into bed without another word, and for the first time in years, Adrian barely slept. The following weeks became increasingly difficult for him. Not because Eleanor demanded anything, she did the opposite. She stopped needing him completely. That quiet emotional distance began consuming him in ways he did not understand. She no longer watched the door waiting for him. She no longer brightened when he entered rooms. She no longer seemed wounded by his coldness. And somehow that frightened him more than tears ever had. One evening, Adrian entered the palace library and found Eleanor asleep beside the window. A book rested gently against her chest while candlelight flickered softly across her peaceful face. For several long moments, he simply stood there watching her. Her pregnancy had softened her features slightly. There was exhaustion beneath her eyes now, but also strength. She looked beautiful in a way Adrian had never truly allowed himself to notice before. Slowly, he stepped closer. The blanket around her shoulders had slipped slightly. He reached down instinctively and adjusted it carefully so she would not grow cold. Eleanor stirred faintly. Her eyes opened slowly in confusion before widening slightly upon seeing him. Adrian? It was the first time she had spoken his name without formal distance. Adrian felt something tighten painfully inside him. You fell asleep here, he said, quietly. She blinked softly before sitting upright. I did not mean to. You are exhausted. Eleanor gave a tired smile. The baby enjoys keeping me awake. For a moment neither spoke, then Adrian surprised even himself. Have I made you very unhappy? Eleanor looked at him quietly. The question clearly startled her. She lowered her gaze toward her hands before answering. You made me lonely. The honesty in her voice cut deeper than accusation ever could. Adrian sat slowly in the chair opposite her. His chest felt strangely heavy. I never intended cruelty. Eleanor smiled sadly. That almost makes it worse. Silence filled the library. The rain tapped softly against the windows. Do you hate me? Adrian asked finally. Eleanor looked genuinely surprised. No, her answer came too quickly, too honestly. I could never hate you. And somehow those words hurt Adrian most of all, because despite everything he had done, she still spoke gently to him. Eleanor slowly stood from her chair. It grows late. She moved carefully toward the door, but paused beside him for one brief moment. The saddest thing about loving someone cold, she whispered softly, is that eventually you begin freezing too. Then she left.
Some marriages begin with love. Others begin with duty, cold promises, and hearts that are never meant to be cherished. But inside the walls of Ravenshade Palace, even the coldest vows can leave scars that last forever. Stay with us tonight, because some dukes only learn the cost of a loyal heart after they've nearly broken it beyond repair.
Adrian remained alone inside the library, long after midnight, staring silently at the empty doorway. The words would not leave his mind. Eventually, you begin freezing too. For the first time in his life, Adrian feared losing something precious, and he had no idea how to stop it. The next morning, palace servants discovered the Duke standing outside the Duchess's chambers before sunrise. None dared speak of it openly, but whispers spread quickly through Ravenshade Palace. Something was changing, and perhaps for the first time since their marriage. The cold Duke of Ravenshade finally looked afraid. The atmosphere inside Ravenshade Palace changed so gradually that most people could not name the exact moment it began. But the servants noticed first. They noticed the Duke lingering near the Duchess during dinners. They noticed his eyes following her quietly through crowded ballrooms. They noticed the way his voice softened whenever he addressed her directly. And Eleanor noticed too, but she no longer allowed herself to hope. That was the difference. One cold evening, Eleanor stood alone in the nursery chamber, overlooking the northern gardens. Small candles flickered around the room, while unfinished baby clothes rested carefully inside baskets beside the fireplace. She moved slowly now. The child was growing quickly. Adrian appeared quietly in the doorway. "You should not stand too long," he said. Eleanor glanced back briefly before returning her attention to the tiny crib near the window. "The physician worries too much." Adrian stepped inside. "The physician worries because the future heir of Ravenshade matters." The words left his mouth before he realized how cruel they sounded. Eleanor became still for a moment, then she nodded softly. "Of course." Pain twisted unexpectedly inside Adrian. "That is not what I meant. It is what you always mean." Her voice remained calm. That calmness frightened him more than anger ever could. Adrian moved closer. "Eleanor." But she interrupted gently. "Do not force kindness now because the child exists." Those words silenced him completely. Eleanor touched the edge of the crib softly. "You spent so long reminding me why you married me that eventually I believed you." Adrian stared at her quietly while candlelight flickered across her pale face. "And now?" he asked hoarsely. Eleanor lowered her eyes. "Now I am simply trying to survive this marriage with what remains of my heart." The honesty in her voice shattered something inside him. For the first time, Adrian truly understood the depth of the damage he had caused. Not dramatic damage, not visible wounds, but years of quiet emotional starvation. He suddenly realized Eleanor had spent their entire marriage loving a man who never allowed himself to love her back, and now she was finally letting go. The realization terrified him. Days later, Eleanor collapsed during a royal gathering. The ballroom erupted into panic. Servants rushed forward while Adrian caught her before she struck the marble floor. "Eleanor!" Her skin felt frighteningly cold. The palace physician arrived immediately and ordered everyone from the chamber. Adrian remained outside the Duchess's room for hours while rain battered the palace windows. When the physician finally emerged, his expression looked grave. "The Duchess must avoid stress completely," he warned. "The pregnancy has become fragile." Adrian's face paled slightly. "Is the child in danger?" The physician hesitated. "Both mother and child are exhausted." The word struck Adrian harder than expected. Both mother and child. Exhausted. Because of him. That night, Adrian entered Eleanor's chamber quietly. She lay asleep beneath layers of blankets, her breathing shallow from exhaustion. The candlelight illuminated the faint shadows beneath her eyes. Adrian sat silently beside the bed for a long time, simply watching her, and slowly. Memories began surfacing, memories he had ignored for too long. The way she had smiled nervously during their wedding vows, the way she used to brighten whenever he entered a room, the way she once waited for him during late dinners, even when he never came, the way she loved him so openly despite receiving almost nothing in return. Guilt became unbearable. Adrian carefully reached toward her hand, resting above the blankets. His fingers touched hers gently. Eleanor stirred faintly, her eyes opened slowly before widening in confusion upon seeing him beside her. Adrian? His throat tightened at the sound of his name. You frightened me today, he admitted quietly. Eleanor watched him silently. I am sorry. Do not apologize. His voice came softer now. Not for this. She studied his face carefully, as though searching for something unfamiliar there. Why are you here? The question hurt because he realized she genuinely did not expect him to care. Adrian lowered his gaze briefly. Because I could not breathe while waiting outside that door. Silence filled the room. Eleanor's eyes softened slightly, but the distance between them remained. You should rest, she whispered. He shook his head. Not yet. For several long moments neither spoke. Then Adrian finally said the words he had never truly allowed himself to admit. I have been cruel to you. Eleanor looked down quietly. You have been absent. The correction pierced deeper than accusation. Adrian swallowed hard. I thought distance would make things easier. For who? He had no answer. Eleanor slowly turned her face toward the window. Do you know what hurt most? She asked softly. Adrian remained silent. It was not your coldness. Her eyes filled faintly with tears. It was realizing I kept loving you anyway. Something inside Adrian broke completely then. He lowered his head, unable to bear the quiet sadness in her voice. Eleanor, please. She closed her eyes briefly. Do not speak gently to me now unless you truly mean it. I do not think my heart could survive false hope anymore. Those words haunted Adrian for days afterward. He began canceling unnecessary military meetings. He spent more evenings within the palace. He accompanied Eleanor during walks through the gardens. He listened when she spoke, and slowly, painfully, he began seeing the woman he had refused to know. She was intelligent. She noticed everything. She remembered small details about everyone around her. She loved books and music. She secretly feared thunderstorms. She adored children. She smiled with her whole face, whenever genuinely happy. And Adrian realized with growing horror that he had wasted years keeping himself emotionally blind. One snowy evening they sat quietly beside the fireplace, while Eleanor embroidered tiny golden initials onto baby blankets. Adrian watched her carefully. You seem calmer lately, he said. Eleanor smiled faintly without looking up. I stopped expecting things. The answer hurt more than he expected. Adrian hesitated before speaking again. And if I wanted to change? Her hands became still. She looked at him slowly. Why? Because I cannot bear the thought of losing you. The words rose inside him instantly, but fear held them back. Adrian had spent his entire life mastering emotional restraint. Now he found himself trapped behind walls he no longer wanted. Because you deserve better than what I gave you, he answered quietly. Eleanor stared at him for a long moment, then she looked away again. Sometimes people realize love too late. Those words settled heavily between them. Adrian suddenly understood something terrifying. She was no longer waiting for him, and if he failed now, he might lose her forever. That realization finally forced him to confront the truth. He loved her. He had loved her far longer than he realized, but fear, duty, pride, and years of emotional discipline had buried the feeling beneath layers of coldness. Now the woman who once loved him openly was slowly disappearing behind graceful distance, and Adrian had no idea how to undo the damage. Before he could speak again, Eleanor suddenly winced softly. Her hand tightened against her stomach. Adrian stood immediately. "Eleanor?" Another sharp pain crossed her face. Her breathing became uneven. "Adrian!" Fear exploded through him. "Send for the physician," he shouted toward the door. Servants rushed instantly through the corridors as Eleanor doubled over in pain. Adrian caught her carefully before she collapsed. Her fingers gripped his coat tightly while tears filled her eyes. "The baby. Nothing will happen to you," Adrian said desperately. But for the first time since childhood, his own voice trembled. The storm raged violently across Ravenshade Palace as servants rushed frantically through the corridors. Doctors were summoned. Fireplaces blazed throughout the Duchess's chambers, and for the first time in years, the great Duke Adrian Ravenshade looked completely powerless. Eleanor cried out softly as another wave of pain tore through her body. Adrian knelt beside the bed, gripping her trembling hand while physicians worked desperately around them. "Her fever is rising," one doctor warned quietly. "The child is early," another muttered. The words struck Adrian like knives. Eleanor's breathing shook unevenly against the pillows. Her face had become pale beneath the candlelight, yet even now she tried to remain composed. Adrian brushed damp strands of hair from her forehead with trembling fingers. "Stay with me," he whispered. She looked at him weakly through tears. "I am trying." Pain twisted violently through his chest, because suddenly the terrifying truth stood before him more clearly than ever before. He could lose her. Not someday, not emotionally, but truly, forever. And nothing inside Ravenshade Kingdom mattered more to him now than the woman lying before him. The physicians ordered Adrian from the room briefly while they examined Eleanor. He refused. "Your Grace, I am not leaving her." No one argued after hearing the dangerous edge in his voice. Hours passed, the storm outside worsened. Servants lit more candles as thunder shook the palace walls. And throughout the endless night, Adrian never once released Eleanor's hand. At one point, she opened her eyes weakly and looked toward him in confusion. "Why are you still here?" The question shattered him. He lowered his head beside her hand. "Because I cannot survive losing you." Silence. Eleanor stared at him weakly, almost as though she believed she had imagined the words. Adrian lifted his gaze toward her, and for the first time since their marriage, there were no walls left inside his eyes. "I have spent years pretending I felt nothing, because I was afraid," he confessed hoarsely. "Afraid love would make me weak. Afraid needing someone would destroy my judgment." His fingers tightened around hers. "But losing you would destroy me far more." Tears gathered slowly in Eleanor's eyes. Adrian swallowed hard. "You loved me when I gave you nothing." His voice broke slightly. "And instead of protecting your heart, I starved it." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly as tears slipped silently across her cheeks. "Adrian, no." He shook his head desperately. "Please let me say this before it becomes too late." The room remained silent except for the storm beyond the windows. Adrian pressed her trembling hand carefully against his forehead. "I do not care about heirs anymore." His voice lowered painfully. "I do not care about legacy or duty or the future of my name if it costs me you." Eleanor stared at him speechlessly. "I love you," he whispered finally. The words seemed to stop time itself. For years, Eleanor had dreamed of hearing them, and now, when her body felt weakest, when her heart had finally begun letting him go, he spoke them with devastating sincerity. Adrian's eyes filled with quiet desperation. "I love you so much that it terrifies me." Tears slid silently down Eleanor's face as she looked at him. For several long moments neither spoke, then slowly, painfully, she lifted her free hand and touched his face gently. The simple gesture nearly broke him completely. "You waited too long," she whispered softly. Adrian closed his eyes, in agony because he knew she was right. Before he could answer, another sharp pain tore through Eleanor's body. The physicians moved quickly around the bed. "Your Grace, the child is coming now." The next hours became a blur of fear and desperation. Adrian remained beside Eleanor through every moment. He held her hand while she cried. He whispered desperately against her forehead. He begged her to stay with him, and just before dawn, the cry of a newborn child finally echoed through Ravenshade Palace. "A son," the physician announced weakly. "The heir lives." But Adrian barely looked toward the child because Eleanor had gone frighteningly still. "Eleanor!" Panic exploded inside him. He gripped her hand desperately. "Eleanor!" The physicians rushed forward while Adrian's entire world collapsed around him. "Her Grace is exhausted," one doctor said quickly. "She has lost too much strength." Adrian felt genuine terror for the first time in his life. He lowered himself beside her pale face. "Please," he whispered brokenly, "please do not leave me now." For several endless moments nothing happened. Then, slowly, Eleanor's fingers tightened faintly around his. She opened her eyes weakly. Adrian nearly collapsed with relief. He pressed trembling kisses against her hand, while tears he could no longer control filled his eyes. "You frightened me," he admitted hoarsely. Eleanor looked at him weakly before her gaze shifted toward the crying infant nearby. "Our son, healthy." Adrian's voice shook. "Beautiful." A faint, exhausted smile touched Eleanor's lips as the nurses carefully placed the child beside her. Adrian watched silently while Eleanor held their son for the first time, and suddenly he understood how foolish he had been for so many years. He had spent his life protecting duty while nearly destroying the only thing that truly mattered: love. The weeks following the birth changed Ravenshade Palace completely. Adrian refused to leave Eleanor's side. He attended council meetings only when necessary. He carried the child himself through palace corridors. He sat beside Eleanor during quiet evenings while snow drifted softly beyond the windows, and slowly, the palace watched their cold duke transform. Servants whispered in disbelief whenever Adrian smiled faintly while holding his son. Nobles exchanged stunned glances whenever he reached instinctively for Eleanor's hand during royal gatherings. But the greatest change remained private. Adrian listened now. He noticed when Eleanor grew tired. He learned how she liked her tea. He read beside her during sleepless nights. He apologized without pride, and every day he loved her more painfully than the day before. One winter evening, Eleanor stood quietly beside the nursery window, watching snow fall across the kingdom. Adrian entered, carrying their sleeping son carefully against his chest. He smiled softly upon seeing her. He finally surrendered to sleep. Eleanor laughed quietly. The sound still felt precious to him. Adrian placed the child gently into the crib before walking toward her. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Eleanor looked at him softly. "You have changed." Adrian wrapped his arms carefully around her from behind. "No," he whispered against her hair. I simply stopped hiding from what I already felt. Silence settled warmly around them. Eleanor leaned back slightly against his chest. Sometimes I still remember our wedding night. Pain flickered briefly across Adrian's face. So do I. His arms tightened gently around her. It is the greatest regret of my life. Eleanor turned slowly toward him. Her eyes searched his quietly. And if you could return to that night? Adrian touched her face softly. I would spend the rest of my life loving you correctly from the beginning. Tears gathered faintly in Eleanor's eyes again, but this time they were different. Not tears of loneliness. Not tears of heartbreak, something softer. He kissed her forehead gently. You once told me the saddest thing about loving someone cold is that eventually you begin freezing too. His voice lowered painfully. Thank you for surviving my winter long enough for me to finally find my way back to you. Eleanor stared at him silently. Then slowly, she rested her forehead against his chest while snow continued falling softly beyond the palace windows. And for the first time since their marriage, Ravenshade no longer felt cold.
Some women are married for power, some for duty, and some only for the heirs they can provide. But the cruelest hearts often discover love only after wounding the person who gave it freely. If tonight's candlelit tale moved you, there are more royal stories waiting beyond the palace gates. Subscribe now so you don't miss any interesting story. Drop your thoughts about Eleanor and Adrian in the comment section. Until next time, see you soon.